The information provided in this podcast is prepared by Ocean Estate Law PC for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. The information is not intended to create an attorney-client relationship. It is not legal advice or a substitute for obtaining legal advice from an attorney. A person listening or watching should not rely upon it in any manner without engaging professional counsel. The information is intended to communicate general information and because recorded may not be current.
Welcome to this edition of the Ocean Estate Law Podcast. My name is Jennifer Elliott. I am a certified specialist in trust, estate, and probate law, and I look forward to being part of this podcast so I can educate you and your family on estate planning, on tax law, many issues we talk about that really the goal is to keep your family out of probate court. But if you need to go into probate court, I have just the guest for you. I'd like to welcome Matt Stein of Law & Stein to the program today. Matt is an attorney with 20 years experience handling probate litigation. His office is in Irvine, and he has years of experience in helping families through the process of probate litigation, and he's going to talk about that further today. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Tell us what you do as a probate litigator.
Sure. So probate litigation is a little bit different than civil litigation. We deal with trusts and estates and amendments gone wrong. A lot of people put planning together that may be inconsistent, and when they pass away, their family members are not happy with what's left, and so there's lawsuits. Our lawsuits that we deal with are called petitions, and they're actually located in the probate courts, which is separate than the civil courts. Here in Orange County, there's about 5 probate judges that will hear these types of litigation cases. And so there's a probate code, it's about this big, that we have to know and have to understand to be able to handle these types of lawsuits. One of the big differences with probate litigation is you're not in front of a jury, you're in front of a judge. And so it takes away a little bit of that emotion that you get with the jury. I have jury trial experience, and it's a lot different when you're talking to a judge versus a jury. But I like it. I've been doing it for about 20 years. I enjoy it. It's definitely dramatic, and I look forward to diving right into it.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, as a probate litigator, why do you think it's important for clients to have an estate planning attorney?
Estate planning attorneys, the first question I ask when I get an estate plan gone wrong is, who drafted this? Where did it come from? Did it come from LegalZoom? I hope not. Did it come from somewhere online? I hope not. Estate planners are critical to the process because they develop relationships with their clients and they understand what's going on with the dynamics of this family, and what they can do is draft an estate plan that avoids litigation. It just absolutely cuts out any controversies. Now, they're not all perfect and things happen, but I always find that when there's a good estate plan, a good trust and will, the litigation is not going to go anywhere. It's going to end real quickly.
Yeah, that's a huge benefit for families. Their goal is to stay out of court. And you're right, a LegalZoom document is most likely going to put them back in court.
Right.
LegalZoom is not going to have that relationship with the family to say, this is what the testator wanted, that the testator had capacity when he signed the document. And I try to explain that to clients, and of course they never see their family as being the family that's going to end up in probate court.
Yeah, and there's always that saying, my family would never sue each other. No, my family loves each other too much. Well, I have a stack of cases on my desk of families that loved each other a lot, but unfortunately they didn't do the planning. And if they did the planning, they didn't go to somebody that knows what they're doing. It's interesting, after a case is done, I usually get my clients, it's the same quote every time. It's, well, I'm going to go get my estate plan done right so I can avoid what mom or dad just cost me.
Right.
And it's unfortunate that some people have to go through that process to learn how to avoid litigation, but it's sometimes necessary.
True. Well, that's what I'd like to cover today. Some of the common things that happen that end up that require families to end up in probate court, and hopefully we can give people some tips on how to make sure their plan is solid. So first I want to talk about creating powers of attorney while a person is still healthy and has a capacity. What do you see on your end?
I get a lot of phone calls from people saying my mom or dad was just diagnosed, or I think they've lost capacity, or I'm taking them to a neurologist. They're not making sense. They're a little bit lost. And it's difficult when a family member is going through that. And my question always is, well, do you currently have a power of attorney over them, whether it's for medical or healthcare or anything, or finances? And a lot of times they say no. Mm-hmm. And the unfortunate situation is if they don't have that power of attorney, as you know, then when that person's diagnosed with something, there's not too much they can do. We have to go into court and get a conservatorship. And conservatorships are very expensive. Now, there are ways to sort of streamline them and get them done quickly, but the courts are really backed up, and so it's difficult. Not impossible, and we do them all the time. But however, if you can get a power of attorney over your loved one when they're competent and they know what's going on, that's going to avoid a lot. And it's a huge, unfortunate conversation you have to have with your parent or your loved one that is going to be uncomfortable. Right? You and I work in uncomfortable places where we have to have these conversations about who do you want to have your assets when you pass away? Nobody wants to think about that.
Right.
Who do you want to have your children if they're not adults and you pass away?
Right. Who's going to raise your kids?
Right.
You want to make that decision, not a court.
Right. And that's where a lot of people delay. They delay. I'm sure you see it in your business in the planning side where people get to that point and then they don't want to make a decision. They freeze because it's difficult, right? They've never had to make those decisions.
Right.
But I find that the families who avoid litigation are the ones having that conversation.
True.
Right.
I had that phone call this morning. My dad is in the hospital, says the caller, in the hospital, and he has a brain tumor. And I need a power of attorney right away. And I say, well, is Dad able to get on the phone and talk with me? Is he going to be released and he can come in and meet with me next week? No, he's non-responsive. It's too late. And had that person called a few weeks earlier while Dad was healthy and well, we could have avoided it for this family.
Yeah, and that goes into unfortunate situations of what I would call elder abuse and undue influence. Mm-hmm. So as we're talking about the older generation and having these conversations, we have to really do the best we can at attorneys of seeing what's going on from a 10,000 foot level, where we're not medical doctors. But at the same time, we have to see who's bringing these people to your office for the estate plan.
Sure.
Is that same person the one getting all the assets?
Surprisingly, it often is.
Yes, right? Magical, right? They drove them there and they get the house.
Right.
And that's where we just have to pay attention to those things and make sure that the person understands where their assets are going and they're okay with that.
Right.
They're not being unduly influenced. But as I see over the last 20 years, it's becoming more and more an issue. I just read in the Wall Street Journal there's massive amounts of money being transferred from one generation to another right now. And a lot of people don't have planning and they don't know what to do with it. And so we're really going to need to work together to help the older generation and push them to get this planning done in a way that's accurate and not done from some online source.
Right. So when you have the right professionals advising you on how to pass on wealth to the next generation, then you get advice like how to avoid capital gains tax, how to get that step up in basis, how to not cost yourself estate tax. So when those people are just making those decisions without the right advice, they're thinking they're saving themselves some attorney fees, but they're actually costing themselves much, much more in taxes and other effects.
Right. Yeah. And I've heard it multiple times, and I'll give you one scenario where somebody says, well, I have my estate planning done. And I say, well, do your children who are adults, professionals, do they have copies of it? Well, no. Well, do they know what's going to happen when you pass? You have a very large estate. What's going to happen? Well, it's none of their business. Okay, I understand and I respect that. However, if it's not going to be even, let's say you have 3 kids and it's not going to be divided 1/3, there's going to be some problems here. And if I may, I'll give you an example of a family that very wealthy individual who kept everything close to himself, didn't provide any information to his son, who's a trustee. And when he passed and I got the banker's box of documents, there were 3 different trusts in there from 3 different estate planners who had no idea that the other estate planners were hired and preparing trusts.
Wow.
I mean, the litigation went on for years because additionally, the kids were not provided an even split, and they all believed that they had a special relationship with their father that was different than the others. And that lack of transparency caused a significant amount of the assets to be spent on litigation.
Right. We were talking about transparency, and I love that idea of having the parents invite the kids, the adult kids, to a meeting in which they're transparent about their wishes, who they choose to be their first trustee, how the assets are going to be split. And I think that's the best thing they can do to avoid probate litigation later.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone takes away anything from today, it's transparency. The question I always get as a litigator is, what can we do to avoid this? Yes, we can have a plan together. Yes, we can, work together on the most sophisticated estate plan and tax, protection possible. But what it really comes down to is having a meeting with your family, sitting around the table with your estate planner, and just explaining what's going to happen. And so that if there are issues prior to the person passing away, they can have those discussions now. Is the daughter, does she want the jewelry from mom and that's not provided in the trust? Have that conversation now.
Sure.
Does the son want something from dad that the daughters don't care about and it's not in the trust? Have that conversation now.
And do it now while you're healthy and well, right, before dad has a stroke, before mom starts to have memory loss signs.
Right, and it always comes down to, well, dad wanted me to have this. He didn't put it in the trust or the documents. And then I'm sitting there in court and I have to argue why dad wanted you to have this, but it could have all been avoided. It really
Sure.
could have. Yeah.
Agreed. Let's talk, Matt, about a common thing that happens. What if a testator wants to disinherit a child? What does that look like in litigation?
It happens quite often. I get a phone call. My mom and dad passed away. My dad passed away recently, and I got a copy of the trust, and I've been disinherited. There's always 2 sides to the story, right?
Of course.
Dad my sister convinced my dad to disinherit me. My dad loved me very much, and I don't know why he would have done this. And this is a very specific example. And I said to the potential client, I said, well, if I spoke to your dad today, what would he tell me? Why would he have disinherited you? And the potential client gets quiet and says, well, maybe because I sued dad a few years ago and I took over the family company and he was always very angry about that.
Maybe that's it.
So 2 sides of the story, right? Like, you got to ask the question to find out what's going on. And backing up, though, to your question, you have to be very careful when you disinherit a child or anyone, because that person, if they don't know about it, and then they find out after you've passed and they read it in your documents, you're asking for a lawsuit. And so sometimes what I'll explain to clients is instead of just completely disinheriting, there's other ways to go about it in which you're giving them very little. It's your assets. You can do what you want with them. However, you also want to protect the people who you're giving assets to.
Right.
Right. So, for example, let's say you want to disinherit your son for whatever reason, and you want to give everything to your daughter. Well, you're literally giving your daughter a lawsuit. That's what you're doing. Okay. And now this poor girl has to deal with this. She doesn't want to deal with this. Instead, there are things that you can do. For example, instead of giving the son nothing, give him enough where he really has to question whether or not he wants to file a lawsuit. As you're aware, there's a no contest provision that's put into a lot of these trusts. And that no contest provision, if he contests the trust, if he files a suit because of the trust, he may get nothing.
So you give him a couple $100,000, and then now he risks losing that couple $100,000 if he goes to court.
Right. He's got to sit there and think to myself, shoot, I could take the 200 and walk away, or I could lose it. I could lose it all. And that's really what you want to do. And then on top of that, you definitely want to explain in your planning documents why.
Why you're disinheriting that son.
Right. You don't want him sitting there going, there's no explanation here. There's no why. It must have been a mistake. Somebody must have been holding his arm and having him sign this. Versus it explains in there, I'm disinheriting my son because he sued me and took over the family company, and I don't want him to have anything from my assets.
Right.
Now everyone sees the reasons, and it's going to be a lot more difficult for him to try to get that trust or amendment tossed as invalid.
Yeah,
So,
great advice.
Yeah. Well, it's sad to see when these individuals, the family members, the mom or the dad are setting up their kids for a lawsuit, right? It's really
Right.
frustrating.
So as estate planners, I love the relationship that I have with litigators because you help me draft better documents by letting me know what's going on in litigation and how I can be more clear in my documents and avoid those lawsuits later.
Good, good. I like to hear that. That's helpful.
So Matt, we've been talking about kids who unduly influence parents from time to time. Let's talk about caretakers who are not related.
Yes, so there's, everybody knows the story of the caretaker who gets hired, comes in, magically marries the person, and then gets them $100 million. That doesn't happen very often. What happens more often than not is there's a new boyfriend, right? The mom might be in her 70s or 80s, been alone for a while. Somebody comes in and gives her a lot of attention. And I have a specific scenario right now where the mother is losing capacity and refuses to really understand that this person, who she calls her boyfriend that's come in, is taking advantage of her. This individual, he used to live in his truck. He has been trying to get her to go to different estate planners to change her estate plan. She won't.
Of course, now he's in the house, I'm
Of
assuming.
course, yeah, now he lives there. He's tried to get her to change the plan. He has taken her keys. He drives her to all her medical appointments. He's on the phone in the background whenever she's on the phone. And her children are trying to help. They're trying to get involved. They're calling Adult Protective Services, doing what they can. And it's a horrible situation because mom just doesn't believe that this person's there for the wrong reasons. But if you look at the actions, unfortunately, he just wants all of her assets. And so we're trying to figure out ways to stop him before litigation, before she passes. And so there's a lot of different tools that we can use to at least try to help the family.
Right. So it sounds like if a family out there is going through that same situation, they need to go talk to their attorneys now.
Absolutely. Their attorneys, Adult Protective Services, they have to be present. They need to go into the house. They need to be with mom. They need to take her to lunch. They need to be aware of what's going on. A lot of times these elder abusers will get a hold of the person's passwords for email addresses and stop the emails from the kids going to mom.
Wow.
And so the kids are like, I've been trying to email mom. And I keep telling them, possession is 9/10. Go see mom. Go there, right? We've talked about, and you're aware of the phrase capture the queen,
Yes.
where whoever has control is, they're the ones who are able to, unfortunately, unduly influence these individuals who, as they get older and the capacity starts to decline, bad decisions are made. So,
that person's blocking the phone calls.
right. And so that's what we see a lot. And so when you read these petitions that are filed in court, it's this 10 pages of all of these bad actors. And unfortunately, a lot of them, a lot of the time, are there to provide care, right? Because they've got access. Now, I will say there are a lot of times that the person there to provide care is doing a great job. If I can give you one example of a client of mine who literally gave this man a new life. He was in his 90s, had no family members, one cousin somewhere distant. And the caretaker came in and invited him to her children's birthday parties, her children's graduation. She got him involved, and he was the happiest he's ever been. I mean, the notes and the journals that we've read, he was thrilled. He left her a lot, and he left her children a lot. That distant cousin sued, saying this was elder abuse. And so there was litigation there over whether or not he knew what he was doing. And because he had capacity, and we were able to prove that at court, the judge agreed this man was allowed to do whatever he wanted with his money. He had not been diagnosed with anything. He had a clean bill of health. He was allowed to give these assets to her and her children.
So in that case, hopefully he had a good estate planner that could help him document his wishes and prove that he has capacity. But
exactly.
we can't avoid those distant cousins coming out of the woodwork.
I know, they're always out there, especially when there's money, right?
Of course.
Everybody comes out of the woodwork for it.
So coming out of the woodwork, let's talk about siblings at war with each other. We see this every day.
Yes. So, most of my cases are siblings fighting, all right, over mom didn't split it evenly or didn't give, the son anything. And then you've got to become the therapist and start sort of peeling the onion back and figuring out what's going on here. There's more to it than mom just not giving it to the son the even amount as the daughter. And typically what I see is not just, the majority of the time it's not just son and daughter, it's stepson and stepdaughter. The sort of mixed marriages, as they come into the marriage, there's a lot of resentment.
Yes.
Again, we're putting on our psychology hats and figuring out where this resentment's coming from. And if mom and dad have a lot of assets before they come into this new marriage and they don't speak to an estate planner, it just causes problems. I've got one right now where dad came into it with 3 or 4 properties, but he and his new wife never went to an estate planner when they got married to come up with a plan here of who's going to get what. And now we have these kids who don't like each other, and it just compounds it and turns into litigation.
They're not going to be able to figure that out themselves on their own outside of court.
Right.
As an estate planner, I have a lot of tools for those families in setting up a plan that protects her assets prior to marriage, his assets prior to marriage, and then perhaps we do trust number 3 that is a community property trust, and that has a family home. So if people hold off on doing proper planning because they don't know how it should look or how this is going to work, they just need to reach out to a professional that does this every day.
Right, yeah, and that saves obviously a headache, right? And it saves hundreds of thousands of their money that they've saved in litigation over the stepkids fighting. I mean, that is the bulk of the lawsuits I'm seeing is stepchildren fighting over the split because when the parents came into the marriage, it wasn't even asset-wise.
Right.
And they didn't figure it out. So
Right.
it causes problems.
We have lots of solutions for that. And I want to thank you, Matt, for being on the show today and helping me explain to our listeners how proper planning today can avoid probate litigation tomorrow. And thank you for being the true professional in helping these families that do find themselves in probate litigation, because there is a way that they can find a good result. And your expertise, you've helped lots of families. So hopefully they don't need to see you, but if they do, I definitely recommend your services at Law & Stein.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. As I tell my clients all the time, just go see your estate planner. Please go have that conversation. So thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you for being part of this edition of the Ocean Estate Law Podcast. We look forward to seeing you in future episodes.